And it is my great honor and privilege to introduce to you our next keynote, Paul Ash, who is joining us from New York. He originally was supposed to be here in person and tried mightily to do it, but he is in New York for the UN General Assembly with the Prime Minister of New Zealand and could not be with us today. But I have to say a little personal story. I'm seeing his face down here. You're not seeing it yet, so I'm seeing it down here. Paul Ash is the New Zealand Prime Minister's Special Representative on Cyber and Digital. And as part of that portfolio, he leads something that's called the Christchurch Call, which we actually have a panel on after here, and Paul has been kind enough to stay on to explain to you what that is. But the call arose from an incident that happened in Christchurch, New Zealand, only months after Tree of Life, when Muslims in prayer were gunned down by a killer who live streamed those killings around the world. And we have heard prior speakers and panels talk about that process and talk about what has come from that. And like us in Pittsburgh, who resolved to do something to make sure that other people did not experience what we experienced, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, and now under the leadership of Paul Ash, have created a global institution called the Christchurch Call, which you will hear in more detail unites governments and tech companies around the world to improve the situation that currently exists and the hate landscape that currently exists online. Their efforts were instrumental in improving the response post-Buffalo and remain influential in continuing to improve the ability of the global world and the global tech world to help be a solution to this intractable problem of hate. Prior to his role, his current role, he had more than a decade of experience in various critical cyber roles with the New Zealand government. And before that, he had a long and distinguished career as a diplomat. And I will tell you, as somebody who, as you know, feels very strongly about the power of individuals to change the world, I will tell you that in various places that I have gone and been, I see Paul. I see him standing there a half a world away from the place where he lives, from his family, and he goes, and he is there, and he is present, because he knows those things matter. And so he is an august keynote, but I also want to say, for the many of you who were involved with Tree of Life and reached out to your brothers and sisters when their tragedy struck in New Zealand, I want you to know that this representative from New Zealand is so committed personally as you would want him and the world to be. So here from Pittsburgh, it is my great honor to introduce you to our next keynote from halfway around the world or from New York at the moment, Paul Ash.
Kia ora tātou katoa, and thank you for that tremendous introduction, Laura. It's a privilege and a pleasure to be able to join you today, albeit unfortunately from a distance. I had very much hoped to be with you in person and able to participate in the discussion in Pittsburgh, a city I've not yet had the pleasure to visit, but one that is on my list of places to get to. Having heard the tail end of the previous speaker too, it's obvious I've got a bit to learn about sports affiliations. I've heard of the Steelers, but never had the chance either to see them at work. Back in New Zealand, where I come from, we play a variant of a similar game called rugby, which many of you will have seen, and it's always good to understand what the wider whānau of sports looks like and the passions and elements of that drive people in various parts of the world. So I'm hopeful I will be able to get back to Pittsburgh, hopefully for next year's summit as a starting point. But having kicked off with that, first, greetings to all of those attending the Global Eradicate Hate Summit. It's An honour to be able to talk today about some of our experiences in New Zealand and how those relate to the work that you are doing and the work that we've heard described by Laura just a few moments ago. I'm conscious as I begin of the origins of this summit. In the attack in late 2008, that event deeply shocked people all around the world because it was an attack on people worshipping peacefully, expressing their faith, and it was so laden with hate that it really resonated across communities in New Zealand and left us deeply shocked, just as it did people in the United States. For me and my family, coming to Laura's point about family, it really resonated even more heavily. One of our close family is a member of the American Jewish community, and we were particularly conscious of the need to support that family member through this time. We saw just how traumatizing, even at a great distance, that event was for extended members of that community. And I think for those in Pittsburgh who have links to New Zealand, you hopefully will have felt the aroha, the Māori word for love, that New Zealanders sent out towards the communities in Pittsburgh when that happened. I guess when that happened, in New Zealand, none of us were aware that only a few months later, we would be facing something similar ourselves with one of our key communities. And the background to the story and the work I'm going to take you through today is that in March 2019, a terrorist attacked 2 mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand, killing 51 people and injuring another 50. That event happened during Friday prayers in those 2 mosques. It was a horrific event that was live streamed by the terrorist for the 17 minutes of the attack. And it was viewed over 4,000 times before it was removed. Those were live viewers that the terrorist had asked to engage in the video and to work in both viewing it and sharing it. The impact was global. Many of you will have seen the videos or elements of the live stream of that attack because they will have appeared, or they appeared at that time in your video feeds or those of people you know well. If you're not someone that was active on social media, odds are you will know someone who is or was and had the video arrive in their feed as part of the event that happened in Christchurch. Over that first weekend or 24 hours after the attack, one of the major social media platforms had to remove 1.5 million copies of that video. And they had automated systems that took down 1.2 million copies, and another 300,000 copies were seen by human beings and removed as a consequence either of flagging or content moderation. For another major platform, they had the video uploaded every second over the subsequent 48 hours. Every second, a new copy. And so what we can see from this is that there was actually a large amount of adversarial activity underway. A community that was feeding off the content of the videos, a community that was being driven by hate, by violent extremism, by a desire to do harm online, and pushing the video back into those major platforms. In a very short period of time, we saw about 800 different versions of the video produced. That was within the first week, in order to thwart the defensive systems that the platforms that were carrying content had in place to prevent the video being uploaded. Again, this speaks to a quite significant degree of effort by a number of adversarial actors, probably no more than 200 or 400 of them, 200 to 400, but it's still a significant number of people. I'll speak a little bit more, not about what happened that weekend, but what we've done since. I think those of us who saw the video, those of us who understand what happened in Aotearoa, New Zealand at that time, saw the significant impact it had and sought to respond. That terrorist attack in Christchurch once again made crystal clear the harms that can be caused both directly by terrorist or violent extremist attack and more broadly by its amplification online. And it highlighted an issue really that transcends borders, it transcends tech platforms, it transcends faiths, it transcends communities. And our determination on that was that it required a global solution. Not only was this a turning point for New Zealand, but it was a turning point for the world in our understanding of the way that the online environment can be exploited and harm caused by terrorists and violent extremists. In short, what happened in Christchurch was a catalyst for global action. And what we needed to do in New Zealand was then take that catalyst and turn it into something that, no matter how tragic the circumstances, might actually leave us with a better environment in the future. And so it was that 2 months to the day after the attack, on 15 May 2019, New Zealand's Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern and France's President Emmanuel Macron brought together heads of state and government and leaders from the technology sector in Paris to adopt the text of the Christchurch Call and the commitments in it. That short 8 weeks was a period that those of us involved in it, from France, from New Zealand, from partners in the tech sector, and from other governments, recall as a time of extraordinary activity. We were working 24/7 to pull together the commitments in the call and to think about how we responded to an act of hate with a set of tools that would enable us to work in a better way in future. We launched the call in Paris on 15 May 2019, and that was just really the first step in the work we've done. As Laura so kindly mentioned, I have spent quite a lot of time since then, many of my colleagues have too, connecting with others around the globe, travelling the world, and looking to build the community I'm about to describe. That first step was critical though, a statement of faith in the ability of both governments and the tech sector to work collaboratively together, to work constructively together to solve problems that affected us all. And a statement of faith that we could do that working together with civil society organisations and other partners across the globe in a way that didn't exacerbate our differences, but actually brought us together around the things we agree on and can work together on in common and form an active community to work together to eliminate terrorist and violent extremist content online. I'd like to take you through some of that effort in a little more detail just now, if I may. And in the panel discussion we're going to have afterwards, we can tease out a little bit more of how that experience has worked for a member of civil society who will join and a member of the tech sector who will also join. So what is the Christchurch Call? It sounds great to have a call to action. What's in it? It's a commitment by governments and online service providers to eliminate terrorist and violent extremist content online. Now, that might sound a relatively straightforward task, but it's actually much harder than anyone anticipated. And it required us to think very carefully around some rather fundamentally important pieces. The first is that all of the work we need to do within the Christchurch Call should be grounded in international human rights law. There is an existing corpus of human rights law that keeps all of us safe, universal, indivisible human rights expressed in the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, in the 2 key covenants, and in the architecture of law that has developed since that time. And the call is grounded very firmly in that. The second is the conviction that a free, open, and secure internet offers extraordinary benefits to society. Things like the ability to express ourselves freely online, the ability to assemble, to work with others online, have been game changers for the world, quite extraordinary. The very fact that I'm speaking with you today on Zoom from New York as a New Zealander travelling to do this work is a good example of that. If we think back over the past 3 years of grappling with a global pandemic, we would not have managed that the way we have been able to without technology. And so those benefits of the internet are things that we need to capture. We cannot afford, just as offline we can't afford to allow hate to allow violent extremism to transform us into instruments of that hate, to transform us into people who might hate in response. So too online, we can't afford to allow the abuse of the online environment, the weaponization of the online environment, to turn us to an environment where we lose sight of the benefits of technology, we lose sight of the importance of a free, open, safe and secure internet. So that underlying principle of respect for a free, open and secure internet sits also alongside international human rights law at the core of the work we do. So things like respect for freedom of expression are fundamental in the work of the core. We're not looking to do anything other than maintain that respect for freedom of expression and support individuals as they're able to do it. There's a caveat though. No one has the right to weaponize, to abuse the internet, to abuse the online services we depend on, to create and share terrorist and violent extremist content. And for anybody out there who has seen the content of the Christchurch video, you will understand exactly why. It's a deeply distressing piece of content. It was intended to be. It not only causes harm to those who are depicted in it, but it also causes trauma and harm to anybody who sees it. And the call is predicated on the basis that there is really no place for that in the internet that we all work. So how do we go about instrumentalizing the call? Well, first, we worked with tech firms, we worked with governments, we worked with civil society to build a set of 24 commitments in the call. And those commitments apply to governments, they apply to the tech sector, and they apply to both working together. And they're quite different commitments because they are based on the idea that not any one of us can solve this problem on our own, and no particular sector can solve this problem on its own. We have specific capabilities and tools in government that we can work with. The tech sector understands the technology way better than we do. It owns it. And it is having to grapple with the effects of people both using that for wonderful, wonderful purposes, but also misusing it and abusing it. And we need to take into account the knowledge that the tech sector has. And civil society has a critical role to play as well. It can't do that on its own. And so the commitments in the call also weave in an advisory role, a role engaging with civil society, engaging with academia as those commitments are carried out. Those 24 commitments cover things that are both offline and online. And again, this is a reflection of the fact that solving the problem of terrorist and violent extremist content online is not something that we can do solely by tweaking an online platform or changing the societal conditions that might lead to terrorism and violent extremism. It's something that needs doing, thinking our way through the drivers of violence, the drivers of terrorism, the societal, cultural, economic factors that lead to that, the radicalization process, the role of governments in ensuring a free and open media, in regulating, in working to encourage voluntary codes, in providing support to their citizens, the role of the tech sector in thinking about the technical tools that might manage things like live streaming and the risks that poses, things like content moderation, and the need for open, transparent appeals processes, things like the technical understandings of the tools that can be developed to support smaller platforms, things like understanding the algorithmic processes that might amplify content online. Those algorithmic processes deliver amazing things for us. Our world has been transformed by them. Search is a good example, the ability to find things online in a way that we might never have understood. And for those of us who first used the internet in the 1990s and looked at index-based search, the world has really shifted as a consequence of algorithmic processes. But there's increasing evidence that those also cause real harm, that as people engage with harmful material, they get stretched out into areas that may be increasingly harmful because of engagement, and there's a need for work there in the tech sector. Those commitments for the tech sector are very much focused on the kinds of things that the technology sector brings to bear. And then there's a set of commitments working together, and that reflects the fact that we actually need to bring those societal conditions, the things that really count for individuals, the drivers of violence and extremism, together with that technical knowledge to make a better online environment for all. As we do that, working with civil society, we actually need to be engaging with a whole range of different communities. And those communities include those affected most directly by the violence that we see online or by violent extremism and terrorism. They include in New Zealand, for instance, the Muslim community, the communities in Christchurch that are still working to recover from the loss of 51 shuhada from that small community, still working to recover from the effects of 50 people injured, having been in the mosques and shot by the terrorists at the time. They're about recovering from the effects of the loss of a sense of security and safety, a community that felt it should be safe in New Zealand, and rightly so, a community that was traumatised by a terrorist coming into our environment and targeting them directly. Something that I know from our experience, the people in Pittsburgh are all too familiar with. Those communities have to be actively involved in the work we do. So too, actually, do the communities that are about protecting other rights online, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, the ability to operate online without government censorship. And so the commitments in the call bring those groups in, and while early on the commitments around bringing civil society in perhaps looked less obvious than those of the tech sector and governments, over time the practice of the work of the call has brought those groups very, very strongly and squarely to the forefront, and I'll explain a little of that in a moment. So, who is in the call? That all sounds jolly good, that we've got these commitments. How have we managed to build that out? Well, since we launched the call, and it launched with 17 countries participating, with 8 tech firms, and with civil society groups supporting alongside, the call community has grown hugely. Today, the Christchurch call has 14 significant tech companies participating as supporters. It has just under 60 countries participating as supporters, and we were delighted in the community last year to welcome the United States of America to that mix. It was tremendous to see that happen. We have worked very closely with the USA right the way throughout, and the administration in May last year decided to support the call and join, something that we and the rest of the community greatly welcomed. Those countries, those tech companies, have all agreed that in supporting the call, they will bring to the forefront the observance of human rights law and of the principles of a free, open and secure internet, but all the actions they take will be consistent with that. We also now have partners in the call. The Global Community Engagement and Resilience Fund, the Council of Europe, UNESCO, Tech Against Terrorism and the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism. And we have an active civil society advisory network of around 50 civil society organisations, academics and researchers. In total, that gives a community of around 120 different participants. And the most obvious thing, I think, that leaps out at me as I explain that, and I'm sure you will have noticed, is that it's an exceptionally diverse group with a huge range of perspectives and views, both on the nature of the problem we face and on the solutions to it. It's taken time across that community to build and grow the confidence for those sectors to feel that the Christchurch call is a comfortable environment for discussing fundamentally uncomfortable topics. And what has been most interesting, I think, for me on reflection, looking back over that 3 years, is that each of the communities, if I think about them as 3 communities, government, the tech sector and civil society, has brought to the table expertise, but has actually brought to the table a sense of concern about what the other 2 parts of that triangle or that troika might be bringing to the table. And it's taken some time to work that one through, to ensure that those at the table, those participating in our discussions are able to do so in a way that is constructive, collaborative and forward-looking. I say that not because our work under the call has been anything other than that through the time, but because most of those groups brought some fairly strongly preconceived notions around what they would encounter from the other groups. And again, this has been one of the powerful lessons, I think, out of the core work. That actually, the people sitting around the table doing this work, as with all of the people involved in today's discussion, are human beings. We come to this work with both passion for good outcomes. I don't know anybody in the groupings we work with in the tech sector, for instance, that wants terrorist or violent extremist content on their platforms. They have built these services because they believe they have a really positive contribution to make, and the use of those services for terrorist and violent extremist ends is something that they are almost universally very, very disappointed by and really committed to trying to find ways to solve. Similarly, the people from government have a very strong sense of the social contract and the need to support and keep their citizens safe. And the civil society actors have a huge passion for the work they do and a passion that in the core community we want to enable. It's been really interesting building those interactions. And we're at the point now, I think, where across the call, we're able to engage in detailed discussion on really difficult issues and to work across those communities to build confidence in each other. Confidence, for instance, that we will ensure civil society are at the table and that we'll provide a good, safe environment for engaging on difficult topics. While at the same time, also being very focused on making progress on delivering the commitments in the call. So how's all that going? Well, we've seen really significant progress so far. The first place we really focused was on crisis response, and on making sure that when events happened, we were able to respond quickly. And sadly, terrorist and violent extremist events happened quite quickly again after Christchurch. One of the awful aspects of this, and it may well be one of the connections between what we saw at the Tree of Life Synagogue and what we saw in Christchurch, is that one terrorist and violent extremist event often begets another. So after Christchurch, we saw attacks, we saw shootings, we saw efforts to live stream them in El Paso, we saw them in Dayton, we saw them in Halle in Germany, where another synagogue was attacked. And we've seen them also in other countries in the core community. We've seen them in India and Thailand. Most recently, and perhaps the most dramatic recent event, and one that sought to imitate what happened in Christchurch very closely, was the attack in Buffalo in New York upon African American communities, upon people peacefully going about their lives, purchasing their groceries. An act of hate and one that sought to mirror and outdo what happened in Christchurch. If I think about the crisis responses over the period of time that the call has been in place, those have become better and better. We have been able to shut down that content far more quickly as a community, whether that's governments using the tools they have around prescribing material or groups, whether that's the companies using new technological tools, new abilities for people to flag content, such that while the Buffalo shooter had worked quite hard to make sure his content could be spread widely, the virality of that content and what we call the prevalence, its ability to be seen, was locked down much more quickly than we would have seen 2 years ago. We've also seen it much, much harder to live stream these days. Companies have got far better tools for detecting terrorist and violent extremist content. And while none of us would say this is perfect, we are in a much better space than we were. And a large part of that is due to the work of working as a community. We also have a really extraordinary not-for-profit now in place. The Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism was restructured and relaunched as a consequence of the call. And I know in the past day or so you've heard from them, from Nick Rasmussen, who is the executive director there, and from his team, about the work they're carrying out in research to understand the drivers of terrorism, in building a hash database out so that content like the Christchurch content does not remain online, that it is hashed and kept out of online platforms, and in crisis response. Those have been significant achievements. We have 4 key work streams underway now to take the call forward. And those sit in the area of further improving our crisis response, a critically important area, in the work of understanding algorithmic processes and designing interventions to prevent radicalization in the first place, in building a stronger tighter community that can work more closely together, and in encouraging greater transparency, not just for tech platforms, but also for governments and how they work in this area. There's a quid pro quo here, and building a community requires work on the part of governments as much as it does on the part of the tech sector. And as we do that, very grateful for the work of civil society in keeping us all on track. Those work streams were set in place last year at a global summit held online of leaders. And I'm in New York because yesterday, President Macron of France and Prime Minister Ardern reconvened the leaders of the Christchurch call in person for the first time since 2019, almost exactly 3 years ago to the day, to review that progress and to look at where we go next. And there's some key pieces I'll just pull out of that quickly for you. The first is that as we've looked at the outcomes of the Buffalo attack, as we've held debriefs with the affected communities, as we've talked to communities that have been part of earlier attacks, as we've worked with the tech firms, we've learned a few things there, both about how we can build and develop the capability to involve civil society more closely in the work of our crisis response. We've also discovered, as major platforms have become less hospitable environments for this content, that small platforms are now grappling to work with the problem of crisis response and of keeping their users safe. And we want a diverse internet. We want small platforms to be able to grow, to compete in the online environment, to mature their services. And so one of the big announcements yesterday was support from Canada as part of the work we're doing under the Christchurch call to Tech Against Terrorism in building support for smaller platforms and enabling those that are well-intentioned and want to look after the users to do so well. We've also recognised the need to build out a work program to look at those platforms that are less well-intentioned, and we've seen some issues with that recently, with at least one platform that has actively encouraged its users to do harm to others. We will pull together members of the community to understand better how we work on that. Much of that will probably be around terms of service and ways to ensure that those firms or small services have less scope to carry out that work. But for the meantime, with that work stream underway and with increasing support from the likes of the Government of Canada, and we're very, very grateful to them and the whole community for that work and support, we will continue to refine crisis response and in particular work with smaller platforms. The second piece, and I think this is where the real focus of the call is at the moment, is to recognise that the safety net of crisis response can't be something that we lean completely on. We actually need to go further upstream and look at ways to prevent radicalisation in the first place. And the biggest challenge here actually has been thinking about the interaction between people and technology. It's very simple to say this is simply an issue of technology, that algorithmic processes radicalise, but that's only part of the problem. Everybody that comes to the internet, everybody that operates online brings with them social, economic and cultural background, and it's actually the interaction between people and technology that some of that radicalisation process is enabled. We were able yesterday to announce the launch of the Christchurch Call initiative on algorithmic outcomes, work that is initially being taken up by 4 of the Christchurch Call partners or supporters in the form of the New Zealand government, Twitter, Microsoft and the US government, to come up with safe ways of interrogating and understanding those algorithmic processes and the way they interact with citizens and users, and to, off the back of that, then start to build out a research program that both manages the privacy issues involved, and they are rather complicated, that manages the questions around proprietary technology, also rather complicated, and that makes this a safe process in order to build better understanding of those processes and then design policy solutions and ways to keep people safer. That's a major breakthrough, and it has the potential to become a game changer over time in trying to understand how those radicalisation pathways work. And it's something that, as the Christchurch Call initiative matures and grows, working with an open source consortium based in the United Kingdom called OpenMind, we will be able to look at adding further partners and contributors to So we see that as a very exciting new step forward for the Christchurch Call in a key area. Finally, at yesterday's summit, leaders looked at another area, which is that around future-proofing the call. How do we think about making sure that as we move into new immersive environments, the call stays current? Because those immersive environments actually pose both some risks as well as huge opportunities. One of the key things there is keeping young people safe. The large majority of people radicalized and operating online in this way are young. And the large majority of people working on particular platforms are often young as well. I'm thinking gaming platforms, the kinds of platforms that operate around those gaming services. And call leaders talked that one through and agreed it would be very important as we look at the future proofing and at this new immersive technology that's coming. Things like online immersive environments, the ability to step almost fully into an immersive environment using either hardware, software, or a mix of the two, to look at ways to build safety in. As well as looking at safety for youth, we're also looking at safety for a range of other groups, particularly the challenge of gender-based online harassment and abuse, and frankly speaking, hate. It's a sad reality that almost all aspects of either violent extremism or traditional terrorism come with a strong gender base to them. There is an underlying strain of misogyny that works its way through much of this. The incel movement is a good example of that. And also increasingly a strain of hate directed at the LGBTQIA plus community in ways that frankly are just unacceptable for the members of the Christchurch community and should be unacceptable for all human beings in the environment we live in. So there is a work program underway now both to look at future-proofing, how we think about those two things. And if I think more broadly about the challenges that the call is now grappling with, they go to some of the adjacent issues. How do we think about the linkages between dis and misinformation, between, frankly, conspiracy theories and or state-sponsored disinformation and violent extremism? And we've all seen aspects of this. Call leaders discussed it yesterday, that in our own communities, there are efforts to drive division, polarization, and underneath that, hate through the online environment that sometimes comes from a place of legal content and lawful content that actually, over time, pushes people into a space where they're radicalized violence. Those adjacent issues are things the call will need to work with. If you'd like to know more about the call, because it's time I wrapped up, I would recommend taking a look at the christchurchcall.com website or reaching out to the team in the Christchurch Call, either in New Zealand or France. We welcome inquiries. We're looking forward to building that community out. And I'll just close in saying, as we go ahead, our job here is to try and reduce the instance of online hate, and to do that by removing the content that drives it. That's important because of the essential issue. It's also important because we depend upon a healthy internet environment. That internet is all around us everywhere we go. It's a feature now of everyday existence. It's almost impossible to imagine going through the day without a suite of online services and the devices that connect us to them. In the Christchurch Call community, we want every human to be able to experience those services in a positive way. Now, the internet is undergoing profound changes that affect each and every one of us, and all of those we represent. What that says is the future of the internet and the future of our open societies intertwined, and the Christchurch Call recognises that in the way it constructs itself and in the way it's evolving over time. It provides ongoing work, occasions when decision makers from different sectors will sit at the same table, supported by their community, to engage in the same conversation and work together on eliminating terrorist and violent extremist content and making the internet a more hospitable place for us all. In terms of how we think about that work, that's got to be a good thing. We have a whakatauki, a traditional Māori whakatauki in New Zealand, that speaks to the importance of looking at a lofty goal and going after it. And we think this one is a lofty goal. It's one that we need to keep pursuing. Whakatauki goes, whaia te ipi kahurangi ki te tohu koe mehe maunga teitanga. Pursue that which is precious. We see keeping people safe, eliminating terrorist and violent extremist content online. And the second part of the whakatauki is do not be deterred by any kind of while not listening to. And that's exactly where we stand. I'd like in closing just to thank everyone for your time today and encourage you as you think about the work we're doing to feel free to reach out to us, and I wish you all the best for the rest of your conference, your Eradicate Hate Summer. Ngā mihi nui, kia ora koutou.